Welcome to the webinar, Board Composition, Consider the Value of Younger Directors. I'm TK Kerstetter, the host of Inside America's Boardroom, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and co-founder and editor-at-large of Corporate Board Member Magazine. On behalf of PwC, Boardroom Resources, and its parent Diligent, it's my pleasure to kick off this exciting hour. This issue of age diversity on boards is proving to be quite popular, particularly with institutional investors. Boardroom Resources and Diligent recognized this movement several years ago and joined the executive and board search firm Spencer Stuart in forming the Next Gen Board Leaders, which is a think tank and community of younger directors who will be tomorrow's board leaders. You may hear some references to the Next Gen Board Leaders in our webinar today, since some of the panelists are active in that community. PwC Governance Insight Center also was on top of this trend and efforted some interesting research, which will be talked about today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's webinar moderator, who will introduce the panel and guide us through this emerging but important topic. I'd like to introduce Catherine Bromilow, who's a partner with PwC's Governance Insight Center. And Catherine, the webinar is yours.
Thank you very much, TK. Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I thought I'd kick off by introducing our panel. To my immediate left is Mike Steib. Mike is the CEO of XO Group, and that is a consumer internet and media company that, among other things, has the Knot and the Bump among its websites and the kind of brands it has. Sorry, I could not figure out the word for brand. But as well, Mike is on the board of Ally Financial, where with the CEO of Ally, they are the only two directors who are 50 or under on the Ally board. To Mike's immediate left is Margaret Whelan. Margaret is the CEO of Whelan Advisory. She's a former investment banker, and she is on the board of TopBuild, where she is the only director on the board who is 50 or under. To Margaret's left is Grady Summers. Grady is an EVP and Chief Technology Officer of FireEye, and he is also on the board of NETGEAR, where, wait for it, he is also the only director who is age 50 or under on the board. And then to Grady's left, and sort of bookending the panel with me, is Leah Malone. Leah is one of my colleagues in PwC's Governance Insight Center. She actually led our research on our census for younger directors. And the good thing is that because Leah and I are, neither of us are subject to any SEC requirements around reporting, we are not going to confirm or deny our age in any way. So just, again, thank you very much for joining us. I know there are sort of three key audiences we have for the webinar. One are sitting younger directors who are very interested in this topic. Another audience, or another group in our audience, are rather more tenured directors, and we really welcome your interest in the topic. And then there are individuals who have some interest in going on boards. And our goal as a panel is to find some really practical tips, whichever sort of those main three groups you might find yourself in, to just have some practical tips to share with you. So let's get started. Every year, PwC does an annual corporate director survey where we hear from between 800 and 900 public company directors. And we asked directors last year what in their mind contributes to diversity of thought in the boardroom. And the number one answer we got was the diversity of age. And that beat out gender diversity, racial diversity, international backgrounds. It even beat out tenure of directors on the board. So on the one hand, it would seem very much that directors are telling us they're very interested in diversity of age. Leah, can you maybe kick us off and tell us, what did our census of younger directors actually find?
Yeah, it's a great setup because that was really kind of the impetus for looking at younger director populations. So all these directors are telling us age is so important when we think about diversity of thought. So great to take the next step. What is the age diversity on boards? So we started with the S&P 500 as kind of a manageable group of companies to look at, and we really examined who's sitting on the boards of all of these 500 companies. We decided to choose kind of an arbitrary number of age 50 and look at how many directors of 50 or under sit on all of these 500 boards. So among these 500 companies, there's more than 5,000 directors. You will be shocked to find that there are not a huge percentage of those directors who are 50 or under. It's only 6% of all of the seats in the S&P 500 are filled by these younger directors. So you can see with our graphic, 315 younger directors fill those seats on the S&P 500. This was kind of shocking to us. I think we all recognize that boards are sort of, the average age is getting a little bit older over the years, but this really small number represented on these largest companies in the US was a bit of a surprise.
Thank you so much for setting that up. Well, given that it is really unusual to have directors who are 50 and under on the board, I thought I'd start out with, and this is going to sound like we're at a comic book convention, but sort of the origin stories of our directors. Mike, I think I'm just going to start sort of down the line. Can you just share how you got on Ally's board and sort of what your path was?
I became a first-time public company CEO in 2014, and one of my friends and mentors on my board advised that it would be a great experience for me to sit on someone else's board, and he didn't say it this way, but essentially see all the things I'm doing wrong through someone else's eyes. So I told some friends that I was looking, and my friend Greg Sedlock at Spencer Stewart called and said, I have a board opportunity for you. I'd seen a couple previously that didn't feel like the right fit. And in this case, it was Ally. I got to meet the board, hear the CEO's plan for the company. I was really inspired and I joined.
Okay. Well, you know, you do have the one piece of advice that I tend to get, which is if you want to be asked to be on a board, just be a CEO of a big public company. But that aside, Margaret, Margaret, sorry, nothing against you or what you brought. You just destroy the panel before we even get started. Margaret, you don't come from the CEO of a public company background. Can you tell us about your origin story and how you got on your board?
Sure. So I grew up in investment banking straight out of undergraduate. So I worked at UBS. I was the top-ranked #1 All-American research analyst for years, covering housing and building products companies for the biggest downturn the industry ever had. In 2007, I switched over the wall to investment banking from research, and I moved to JP Morgan from UBS with the exact same Rolodex of clients and industry expertise. And one of the companies that I had covered very early in my career is Masco, which is also publicly traded on the NYSE. They were spinning out a company called TopBuild about 3 years ago, and they contacted me because they were looking for a new board, new directors to put together a diverse board. And so the diversity that they were looking for is a qualified financial expert and then a woman. And generation did not go into it.
Okay. Grady, how about you?
Sure. So I am CTO at FireEye. I spent most of my career actually at General Electric on the enterprise side of security. Spent some time in consulting, and love the security industry, but didn't want to have blinders on and just do that all the time. So I wanted some of the more diverse experience that would come with being a director. So similarly, knew some folks at Spencer Stewart, kind of threw my hat in the ring there. It was interesting. I actually interviewed for one board position that didn't work out, but it's funny in hindsight, it would have been such a poor fit. I won't say what the company was, but I was all excited, like, oh, this would be great, to be on a board. Sometimes things work out for the better. I probably would have jumped on it if I'd been offered it, but ended up passing on that one, and then had an opportunity to go to NETGEAR, whose product is really dependent on strong cybersecurity. They want a cybersecurity expert. Similarly, generation just didn't come into it all, but they were willing to take a shot on a first-time board member, which worked out.
Great. Well, thank you. Leah, maybe sort of switching gears a little bit. We talked about, or you shared the fact that there really aren't that many younger directors, 50 and under, on S&P 500 boards. what do we see in just even in terms of multiple younger directors on boards? I mean, from up here, Mike's the only one who's on a board with two directors who are 50 or under, and one of them is the CEO.
Yeah, and we found that that's actually a very common experience. So this is kind of a graphic of a breakdown of the S&P 500 companies. Among those 500 companies, 57% don't have a single younger director. And again, those are people we're defining as 50 or under. 16% have more than one, 27% only have one. So we see a very small percentage of companies that have anything even close to a critical mass of younger directors. If you're, it's the same conversation that we have often around race and gender. Is it really enough to only have one director who fits into a certain diversification bucket in order to really have representation on the board? So it's really a very small percentage of companies that do have more than one. And I will say that it's also quite common among all of the companies that have at least one younger director. It's quite common that that person is the company CEO or another executive. So out of our 315 people I referenced before, about 50 of them are the CEO of the company, and they're on the board because they're the CEO.
Well, thank you. Let's maybe move into the whole area of actually settling into the board. One of the things that the Spencer Stuart Board Index tells us is the average age of S&P 500 directors is 63, just over 63. And the directors on this panel are somewhere in the range of 2 decades younger than that average age. Margaret, I think I'm going to put you on the spot first here. You've been in boardrooms sort of your entire career, between research and banking. I think you shared on our planning call that there was a difference when you got into the boardroom, though, as a director. And can you maybe just talk a little bit about, how that fit in, or how you started to fit in, or just what your experience was?
Sure. So yeah, throughout my career and with my advisory business, currently I'm in boardrooms frequently, very regularly, at least once a week, talking about trends, opportunities, M&A transactions, and so on. And so when you're going there as an advisor, as opposed to as a director with a vote, it's a very different dynamic. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was at JP Morgan, we were getting ready to do a pretty big pitch to one of the clients in my universe. And I was preparing the call with the CFO and the head of our M&A group. And they were saying, there's this one woman on the board, she asks a lot of questions, but you can zone her out. And so this is kind of the mentality that you get sometimes when and you're laughing, Susan, because you know how this works. But you kind of find, I think, as someone who's young and been very engaged, you're probably more prepared, you're asking more questions, you might have been trying harder, you're not taking for granted that you're in the room, but you still have one vote, and each of us has one vote. And I think the most valuable thing is, it's not necessarily the formal onboarding, but it's finding your place and your expertise. So for me, I'm an industry expert and I'm a financial expert. So there are areas that I can help a lot, and then there are areas like the expertise that Mike and Grady have that I would have no value to add in marketing and IT or tech, but I go to a lot of the PwC conferences to try and get up to speed.
Yeah. Grady, how about you? How about fitting in when you really are noticeably maybe the youngest person?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate to be on just an awesome board for a younger director and a first-time director to be on. I found the board very, kind of took me under their wing, and I had one-on-one meetings with most of them as we got started. They all gave advice. Even now, it's been 2.5 years, and they'll still say, hey, if there's anything that you want to go off to the side or after a meeting and talk about, we'd be happy to do it. So it's been a really good board, and I think that's an important thing as you look to join a board, a younger director, making sure that it is a cultural fit, that it's a good board for a first-time director. So it's been really good. I definitely agree with Margaret. I think there's a good pressure to be extra prepared and kind of prove yourself. And so I think all of our directors on my board are very well prepared, but I know I definitely put in that extra effort to make sure that I've viewed every page of the board materials and that I don't take it for granted.
Yeah. Well, for any of you, how about the sort of the relationships between the meetings? Because there's the board meeting itself, but only a bit, well, it's not that only a bit of the work gets done, but that's not the whole extent of the work.
I'm on, with TopBuild, for example, I'm on all 3 committees, but I don't chair any of them. So if there's anything that's time sensitive, we would have a call. In particular, we announced a very large transaction, $500 million transaction a couple of months ago. So it was running through the diligence process on that. And as a director, but also as an M&A banker, they invited me to be in some of the meetings. And then also the financing, preparing for the financing. So that was an important part of it. I think one thing that you have to be very sensitive to, especially as executives, as opposed to retired board members, and a former colleague of me gave me this advice, is to zoom in and help, but to zoom back out again. So if anything comes up in particular around strategy between meetings, you can be helpful and relevant, but just to remember to not be too involved. Because boards have to be separate from the team.
No, I was going to say, I've although I haven't experienced it on the board that I'm on, I've talked to other younger directors who do struggle with so many meetings taking place kind of outside of the normal board meetings, often informally, whether it's over golf or over a meal that's not on the agenda, it's not a scheduled meeting. And definitely, I think when you have a younger director, and can I just say, by the way, I love that you define youth as under 50. That's really good. So young, but it's, we're going to have full-time jobs, and it's harder to make those. So I think that's something boards need to be aware of, is just being conscious of the demands on every board member.
I have 2 children in pre-K, so I'm the granny mom when I go to school, but I love being considered young too.
Yeah.
Mike, I guess just turning to you, one of the things that we did here when we were doing the research, and we interviewed a number of directors as well as just looking at the numbers, was a sense that just being by virtue of something that really Margaret referred to, is just the energy in the room and, bringing a real dedication to do your preparation, that they sort of were helping change boardroom culture. Do you have any observations on that? Do you think that's sort of might just be the perception of that individual?
I'd say first, I think my age coming into the board was not your thing was scratching.
Oh,
You've been demoted to hand mic. My age in coming onto the board, I don't think in and of itself was an asset in any way, and I don't think it would have been a liability if I was 40 years older. Instead, in this case, the board felt that the board needed someone who had particular expertise in consumer digital experiences, in business model transformation, and has spent a lot of time close to and thinking about young consumers, specifically young digital consumers. And just the sample of people who have that, if you look at the sample set, it's going to skew younger. So if anything, it's a liability that I came into the board with only 2 or 3 years of public company board experience, only 2 or 3 years of public company chief executive experience. But for the board, it was okay to make that trade because I brought these other things that were new. And I think because the board, it's a really well-run board, it's a really strong board that intentionally was seeking out complementary skill sets. What I was able to contribute to the conversation came via those complementary skill sets.
TK told us that when he did his poll of next-gen directors, that one of the areas that there was a lot of concern on, and I think we mentioned it earlier, was on just the whole topic of onboarding and maybe the ability to, for boards to do a better job of onboarding newer directors. I mean, Grady, maybe I'll just start with you on this. From your perspective, what advice would you give? Because I'm not going to ask you to rate your onboarding because that just gets a little too personal. But what advice would you give established boards when they are bringing on a director who might be a little younger in terms of the onboarding and the inculcating to board culture?
It's an interesting question. I'm kind of 2 minds about this one, because there's certainly an argument that maybe companies should be a little more, or boards should be a little more cognizant of the background of the board member, and for a younger board member who might not understand, kind of what's the role of the board, the expectations, the constructs, how committees work. There's an argument to be made that maybe there should be more of that in the onboarding process. I think the flip side of it is anybody who's given the opportunity to serve on a public board, could probably speak for everybody up here, there's an expectation like we should be able to come up to speed, and we should be able to reach out to other resources in our network, or other board members we know, to come up to speed on those things. So I don't want to make it sound like we have to be spoon-fed this stuff. I know in my case, I did talk to people I knew who were on other boards. I read everything I could get my hands on about sort of board governance and best practices. So I don't know, I could see both sides of that argument.
I first and foremost, the shareholders are not discounting their expectations for you to be a shepherd of their capital because you're younger than the other directors. It's your job to be a great director. And so you have to do your homework. Also, a lot of younger board directors are first-time board directors and just have not been through the ringer on governance-related stuff. So you have to make sure you get yourself educated on governance. I spent many days deep in the details of how the business was run and operated, not with the board and the CEO, but with people in FP&A and people in line functions, just to understand how it all works. So that when I came back up to the level of being on the board, I could be useful and I could be knowledgeable. On the other side, I had an experience where I was assigned one of the leaders of the board was going to be my buddy as I came in. Presumably to make sure I didn't break anything, but just to have one person rather than 12 board directors who are all hoping you do a good job, one board director saying, I'm going to make sure you do a good job, I found to be a really powerful added benefit in my onboarding.
Have you extended that to your own board? Like the idea of a board buddy for any new directors?
We have not done board buddy, but we have done we have done more extensive interviewing and onboarding than I think most boards, the vast majority of boards do.
Margaret, any other advice you would give?
You know, we've touched on it a little bit with some of the conversation, but we need refreshment in boards. The U.S. boards, we need to establish and then enforce age and term limits. And when we're not doing that, we're missing the mark. Activists come in, and you see most of the turnover in U.S. boards right now is activist driven. Usually there are 2 or 3 new directors coming in. So if you can be a part of that as someone who's bringing diversity, the onboarding opportunity with a couple of peers is going to be a lot more fun and easier than walking into a board that's so established. And I don't know if the other two find this, but I got calls saying, oh yeah, we have this company and they need a director. And I'm like, great, to see my resume, what part of my skill set are you interested in? They're like, we just need a woman. Well, I'm not that interested, but thank you. And unfortunately, you get that all the time from the headhunters, whereas someone who really values your expertise, it's going to be more interesting. I also think, because of Sarbanes-Oxley, the committee meetings have become very cookie cutter in terms of what's covered. The strategy sessions are so much more interesting to me. So that's how I go to industry conferences. I read all the research reports from the equity and debt analysts who write on our stock. I listen to the conference calls of the peers. You can do that pretty efficiently. And then it's continuous learning as opposed to just onboarding.
Well, I want to almost circle back to something you said and that we actually talked about on our prep call. I remember you were saying that, you almost had a few principles when you were sort of thinking about board service at first. One of them was the idea that you didn't really want, I don't know if I'm squeaking or not, but you didn't really want to necessarily be the only woman on the board or the only young director. And then you say you sort of had to get over that pretty quickly.
It wasn't even my own principle, but a mentor of mine said, don't be the first woman and don't be the only woman. And what I said to her is, if you look at the publicly traded housing and construction companies in the S&P 500, most of them do not even have one woman. And one of the biggest ones, the average tenure of their director is 17 years. They're all over 70 years old. Imagine how much fun it is to go into that room with a bunch of cronies every quarter. No, thank you, right? They would really need to refresh a lot of the board to make that interesting. But, I would say that was advice was given to me 5 years ago as I was thinking about adding this skill set to my career. What I would say and what was most relevant when you and I were talking a couple of months ago about board service, and I was saying actually the biggest challenge I found is not my gender, it's my age. Because these peers are used to interacting with each other and then maybe not with someone who's younger and they don't think about things the same way. And so that has been the biggest challenge. And then TK and I started talking last year about Next Gen, and I got to meet some of my peers because of that. We have some fun conversations. We sponsor and buddy up with each other because it takes time. And then it's incumbent on us to bring more young people into the boardroom.
Well, it's interesting. There's, we got I think an email or TK and his group got an email from a more tenured director who actually was arguing that the younger directors that he or she had seen weren't all that effective in the boardroom. And, you know, Mike, maybe I'll put you on the
You
spot.
go right to me?
Well, yeah. But I think you were talking a little bit about some of the skills and you know, whether younger directors should, that all of the younger directors that maybe are finding their way into boardrooms, whether or not that's relevant or not. Or
I think I would reject the premise that someone is going to be more effective because they're younger or less effective because they're older. Instead, if you can put together a board with diverse gender, ethnicity, age, and backgrounds and experiences, diverse functions, who fill out the capability set that you want and need from your board at this time, you're going to have a great and really high performing board. If instead you just set out and say, I just must have somebody under 45, or I just must have somebody in tech, find me wherever you can, you have to be really lucky to find someone who's great, who met that broad expectation of who you're adding. So if a board just sets out to find a younger person, you're just going to get a younger person, and that's going to be too bad.
I would put that on the board, not providing the opportunity for that person to add value. But if only 6% of directors are under 50, and in the same survey, more than half the board said at least one director is completely inept or disengaged, then we have, what's the percent if we look at that of the older directors who are not helpful versus us taking one for our generation.
And just for everyone, what Margaret's referring to is last year in our annual corporate directors survey, 46% of directors said at least one director on their board should be replaced, which is sort of the high watermark for us asking the question in those results.
Yeah.
Although to be fair, only about 12 or 13% said that it was because of someone's advanced age led them to be a less effective director. What we found was that they were naming a whole bunch of reasons why directors are not as effective on their boards as they should be.
Yeah.
And among those, you know, there are almost some of the examples of why we're opposite. So one was they weren't questioning management hard enough, and the other was they were overstepping their oversight bounds. So it's sort of like you can't make anyone happy all of the time.
Yeah, for sure. But I think Mike makes a really interesting point too, though, that you shouldn't assume someone will be more effective because they're younger or vice versa. I almost take that a step further. By definition, a younger director just has less experience and they have less to draw on, less time at management, less time on other boards. So I think we can't stress that enough, that you don't want to add a younger director just because you want to add a younger director. I think it's a side effect or something that happens when you are looking for a particular skill set. You find the right cultural fit on the board, and kind of that unique combination of things that you can't find elsewhere, and they happen to be younger.
There are not a lot of teams that are failing because they just lack inexperience. I think going out and looking for a specific skill set and then being willing to make the trade-off that comes with taking on a younger director to get that skill set seems to be the path to having a good fit.
Well, maybe let's move on. Leah, I have never seen a lot of data on the proportion or percentage of directors overall who are maybe like retired from active employment versus have day jobs and get W-2s a lot of the time. But what do we know? And I think the only stats we sort of see from Spencer Stewart's board index are the average age is just over 63. And I think they refer to the fact that almost 3/4 of the members on an audit committee are retired. And so that's, at least three audit committee members on a board. What did our survey find, or our census find, in terms of the younger directors and what their employment looks like?
So we dug in pretty deeply into these 315 people, and we found that 96% of them have what we would think of as a day job, kind of an active career. And this goes exactly to what Margaret and Grady were talking about before, the balance of time, right? Most of these 315 people are working very busy day jobs. They might be the CEO of their own company, they're high-level executives. They don't have a lot of time in their lives for extra activities. So fitting in board service is a real struggle. And I think there is a strong tension here between the time demands and what those people have to give, and on the flip side, the fact that because they are actively working, engaged in the workforce, oftentimes at the executive level, they have really current experience to bring to bear in the boardroom that a retired director just doesn't have. They don't have that benefit of being on the job day to day and seeing what's happening in real time. So there's a plus and a minus there. It's kind of the double-edged sword.
So Mike, I'm going to put you on the hot seat again first. So you're sort of a great example of what Leah said. You are an active CEO of a public company and also on an outside board. How do you make the time? How do you balance the various demands?
You just have to really rigorously partition your time. I think you can take on an extra thing like this professionally, especially when it's something that, in my experience, board service is something that makes you a much better executive, and vice versa. I think being a sitting executive can make you a better board director. So you have to block out the board meetings, the time before the board meeting to prep the committee meetings, but you also have to carve out. I have it blocked on my calendar to review our earnings scripts, listen to the earnings call. That's something that if you don't force yourself to make time for it, it'll never live in the top 10 to-dos this month, and you just won't get to it. So it requires advanced preparation and carving out time. And it cannot come at the expense of your day job. It has to come at the expense of your leisure time. So I don't watch television. So it's a fair trade.
Grady, maybe I'll go to you next, because one of the things we found on our planning call is both you and Margaret have a number of children, probably a little double the national average of children. How do you make everything work? Because also you're not the CEO of your company, at least yet, and so you maybe don't have as much leeway as Mike might have to rearrange his schedule.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, I think it comes back to partitioning time, like you talked about, and you figure out what you're going to cut out. You know, I can't cut out time with the kids on the weekends, for example, so you cut out things like TV. We are fortunate that I think we're all probably in a situation where our board work does make us better executives, better business leaders for our day jobs, if you will. So I've never looked at it as something that I have to kind of hide from my CEO at FireEye. I think I'm fortunate to have leadership there that recognizes like this does make me a better executive. So it's still partitioned though. You're still putting in the heavy hours on the day job and then spending your nights working on board work. But I love it whenever somebody says, man, I really want to be on a board. Like you get paid to go to 5 meetings a year. That must be great. You know, people don't understand the amount of work that takes place outside of the sessions.
The hourly rate comes down.
Yeah,
pretty
it does
quickly.
quite,
Through the problem.
I remember one gentleman who's on an audit committee described it as reading War and Peace 4 times a year, but without the plot line and everything. There's a lot of work to be done. But let me ask, just build on that a bit, Grady. How did you even approach the discussion with your employer about the board opportunity? How did you have to sell them? And
I'm fortunate that it had been brought up several times at my company enough that we decided to just set out a policy about it prior to me even having asked. So we had a policy that kind of specifies how many boards, outside boards, an executive can be on and what the approval parameters are. And, like at most companies, you get approval from the CEO, the general counsel. You make sure there's no conflicts. You're very clear about being done on personal time. So in my case, I was fortunate that there was a pre-existing policy I could kind of step into and use.
Margaret?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in 2 ways. One on the professional front and then on the personal front, because that's what balance comes down to. I think professionally, I resigned from JP Morgan and running a group 4 years ago because my time is so valuable to me. And I just wasn't having as much fun. I wasn't involved in transactions and deals as much as I wanted to be because I was running a group and it was just more oversight, especially at the big banks. So I started my own business and that helped me to really have 100% influence over how I spend my time. The board service was important to me, but I only wanted to be on boards where I had relevant experience. I didn't want to be on boards in Europe or in Asia, even though I'm traveling globally every couple of months. I just didn't want to commit to that longer term. So the boards that I'm on are in the industry that I work in every day. So that makes the strategy part of it easier to be on top of because it's part of my day job. And personally, I think like most working moms, I'm incredibly fortunate to have a great partner. My husband is a full-time parent. We have 4 children, the oldest is 7. So it's, it's hectic. I think I said on the call, one of the funny parenting experiences I had is we had 2 Colombian girls to live with us, these nannies, and they taught our children to speak Spanish, which was very important to me, except I don't speak Spanish. So now I'm totally outnumbered in my house in terms of communicating, and they hide stuff from me and I don't know where it is. But I'm also on 3 nonprofit boards locally in our community around my children, and I bring them to board meetings. I run the finance committee for all 3. I bring the committees into my home because I think it's great for my children to see that, especially my girls. I have 2 girls.
Would all of you say that pursuing the board role is entirely worth it then? Or
I think it depends. It depends on the impact that you want to have with your career and the professional development needs that you have as a leader. I think for me, it has been completely worth it because I believe in the mission and the team of the company on whose board I sit. And for me as a leader, I'm doing a better job as a result of investing that time on my board. For my executives, I'm actively seeking board opportunities for some of my executives because I've seen how impactful it can be. So generally speaking, I'm a believer, but for each individual, it depends on what they need.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. In my case, we talked earlier about how I think the board work makes me a better executive. It's also been very fulfilling in that we've gotten to do some kind of cutting edge things. We've created a cybersecurity committee, which there aren't many out there. So it's been a lot of kind of figuring out how we're going to structure this as we go. So that's been neat to kind of pioneer kind of a combination or that nexus of the industry I come from and cybersecurity with the board work.
Yeah, I mean, board work is definitely very meaningful, especially if you have influence. You have 1 vote, the same as everyone in the room, which is a balance that you need to train yourself to get used to because most of us are used to managing or running big groups or big companies. And so it's fun, it's challenging and stimulating.
yeah, the thing that when I introduced Margaret, I talked about TopBuild, which is her public company board, but you're also on a private company board as well as a number of not-for-profit organizations.
Yeah,
so.
I'm on the board of the largest private housing company in North America, Canada, and the US, and then I'm on 3 advisory boards and 3 nonprofit boards. Wow. Yeah.
Well, moving right around, let's actually talk about skills. And Leah, I'm going to flip to you. Can you maybe share a little bit about what we found being described from the skills of the younger director set, and even I think share a little bit of where do the younger directors tend to come from, and what kind of boards are they on?
So you will probably not find this terribly surprising, but a huge percentage of the younger directors have technology backgrounds. About a third have some kind of a background in technology. But what was a little bit surprising to us was that there was even a greater percentage of younger directors who have a background in finance. So Margaret's a perfect example. We have a great representation here on this panel of exactly what I'm talking about, because the third one is executive experience, which is often as a CEO role or another executive role. So those were the 3 kind of main types of backgrounds we saw. We also saw a sprinkling of academics, public policy experts, marketing experts, that kind of thing. But the real emphasis, I would say, was in finance, technology, and in executive experience. And so when we look at what companies these people then serve on the boards of, it doesn't necessarily line up with this. And I'll just flip to the next slide. So we looked at, within the S&P 500 companies, which types of industries are the most likely and the least likely to have younger directors on their boards. Again, you won't be terribly surprised to find that information technology companies were pretty likely to have younger directors. They were the most likely sector to have younger directors. Beyond that, it goes to consumer companies, consumer discretionary companies, and consumer staples companies. On the flip side, though, I think what we did find kind of surprising was that even though a huge percentage of younger directors have a background in finance and technology, very few of the S&P 500 companies within that sector themselves have younger directors on their boards. So they're sending their folks out into the field, and they're going and serving on other boards, but they don't have, I guess, perhaps the same need or they're not putting the same emphasis on having younger directors serve on their own boards internally.
So thanks for that setup. Mike and Grady, let me start with you. You both are with very tech-heavy companies. Social media and the digital experience is something we hear a lot about, particularly from boards where they are really just concerned with whether their board is keeping up and really understanding issues regarding technology, let alone cybersecurity, because every director out there is pretty much horrified on the cybersecurity front. Can you just share how directors who bring the kinds of skill sets you have in the technology, how are you helping boards, or how could other directors who sort of have your background really help your board? Grady, maybe I'll start with you, because you did talk about the new cyber committee at NETGEAR.
Sure. So, obviously I was brought into this board for a specific set of expertise. And as much as I want to grow in my abilities as a director, and I'd like to be known as just a good director, not a good cybersecurity director, kind of like you were saying, Margaret, in a different way. That said, I am there for a very specific reason. And so I probably jumped in and kind of went narrow focus or a little bit deeper, maybe than if I had just been brought in as a general board member, spending a lot of time with the management team, on the cybersecurity side. And then putting some frameworks into place so that we do have a repeatable process for every cybersecurity meeting and the update to the broader board every meeting. So there's a lot of building things for the first time, building the structure, and then working with a really great management team to figure out how they could best interlock with that. I would say it can be a double-edged sword, and I think we've got to be careful. This isn't just a younger director thing, but anytime a director comes in with a specific skill set, making sure you don't try to go fix problems and essentially become like a high-level consultant. And there is a temptation because you see issues, you say, I know how to fix that. I fix that in my day job all the time, and you want to jump in. So that's been a learning experience.
Just out of curiosity, have you found any of your role in just sort of helping your fellow directors better understand issues as well?
Definitely. So we've tried to we have a cybersecurity committee, of course, with other directors on it. And we've spent time having outside experts come in and talk about security. So yeah, absolutely. I view part of my role as making sure that the entire board gets smarter on cyber.
Mike, you're sort of much broader. You're not just cyber, but social media and the digitization and just how to deal with the new consumers in the new digital society. What would you recommend people with your similar backgrounds bringing to boards from the tech side? How can they add the most value?
I think there's two things. First, it's important not to be a one-trick pony on a board. If you're going to sit on a board, you need to have an informed opinion on capital allocation, not just whether or not to use Instagram. I think it's really important to know the business top to bottom and to understand governance and your responsibilities top to bottom, because you're there to represent the interests of the shareholders across the board. And then in the area where you bring particular expertise, it varies. I think it varies by situation. In the board that I joined, I ended up helping to form and then chairing a committee focused specifically on digital. And what that did is it ensured that there was, at every board cycle, a real tight focus on this area that's really important to the company, but that when you look at it along with all of the other issues that a board will cover at a board meeting, is at risk of not getting enough targeted focus. And then in between board cycles, I can be available to the team that's doing it day to day, if I can ever be useful.
I think between your advice and Grady's advice of not necessarily solving the issues for the management team, but just really being a great resource. It's excellent. Margaret, I guess maybe moving on to you, you represent sort of the number one skill set that younger directors bring. I guess you are on the audit committee, and you talked a little bit earlier just about you really digging into the strategy side. Are there other sort of skills that you think and really identify with bringing?
I think the industry expertise, because I've been in the industry for over 2 decades, balancing the use of capital day to day with the risk taking around the strategy and trying to help the team anticipate what might be around the corner. In our industry right now with the US construction industry, McKinsey did a great report last year and they had us down with agriculture in terms of the least innovative industries, and we're being disrupted. We have Japanese housing companies buying US builders with European companies coming in, trying to change the way we build houses and the products we use. I think a lot of the public companies in my industry will be obsolete if they don't innovate. And so that's something that I work with my companies on. Let's be a leader in this without taking too much risk. But I think no matter what, it's always just helping anticipate what's around the corner, because the teams are so busy day to day running the business and then managing the shareholders. As Mike said, we're in the room on behalf of the shareholders. They're paying us and trusting us to be there because they're not there.
TK, I think in a minute we can take the questions from the webinar audience. But I will say one of the things that we found was pretty interesting when we did our interviews with particularly some of the younger directors, and Leah, if you want to share a little more color on this, is the fact that many of the younger directors said that they were being pulled in, and they had backgrounds like our panelists here, so either, you know, tech or finance, but they were being pulled in to talk about sustainability issues and things that were really not in their sweet spot, because I think the assumption was that you're a younger director, you must be hip and jiggy with all of the sustainability and the
Which we definitely are.
Yeah. Or as you said, we're available.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You don't have to be the eager beaver.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was another interesting point I think we found when we conducted interviews and when we dug into the details, is that younger directors serve on just as many committees as other older directors who are more likely to be retired, which goes to the time point. But we also found that they were more likely to serve on the committees, like a sustainability committee, a policy committee, an IT committee, some of the issues that tend to be thought of as sort of younger issues. And we did have several directors who said to us that their fellow directors would look to them to have a point of view on what they thought of as a young issue, when it was something that they actually had no expertise in at all.
Okay, TK? Questions?
Okay, we did get some questions from the audience, and I've picked out two, which I believe we have time for here today, and they are both directed towards our next gen panelists. So the first question was, depending on their age, the directors on today's panel could serve for almost 30 years on the board. That probably wouldn't sit well with investors. What does the panel suggest for addressing the board refreshment issue?
Well, I tell all my boards that I'm available for 2 terms, and I think that's enough for me to add value for them and for them to get enough out of me. I'm a big believer in refreshment.
What's a term?
It's different for each board, 3 to 4 years. We get voted, it's an election by the shareholders.
And it's an interesting question. You're right, because when somebody's joining a board at 65 or 70, you don't have to grapple with that question in the same way. So I hadn't thought about that. It's not a question we've directly addressed on our board. I certainly wouldn't expect to serve for 30 years. No, I would investors, not like that. I probably wouldn't, that's a long time to be in one place. So haven't directly addressed it, but I would think that we think of some sort of limit as a couple terms progress.
I don't know. Everybody loves term limits when they're 45. I think, if I could have 2 responses to the question. So personally, each year on my anniversary, I ask the chairman and the CEO for a review. I ask how am I doing. I ask very specifically, am I in the top half of the board directors in terms of the impact I'm having on the company? And I express to them each year, if I'm ever not, I want you to know that I'm more than happy to make room for someone else. And that sort of ties to my second point, which is, I think all this stuff around term limits and board age limits and so on comes back to boards avoiding conflict. And I don't think you need those things if you have a board that's communicating well, that's open and honest, and that is willing to bring issues to the fore for the best of the company. And I work on boards that do that. So an age limit or a term limit or any other forcing function would be unnecessary.
Well, you must have been, Mike, you must have been the one that submitted the second question then.
Okay.
The question that we got was, do any of the panelists sit on a board where they evaluate individual directors as part of their annual board assessment? And what do the panelists think about peer-to-peer?
I'm happy to respond. We don't disclose specifically how we do board assessment and governance on the two boards that I'm on. The story that I just shared is that me personally as a director, I want to ensure that I'm creating the space for it to be safe and comfortable for the leaders of the board and the company to give me feedback and ask me for what they need from me. And that I create the room so that if there ever needs to be a discussion about whether or not I'm a great director, we can have it.
Similarly, we don't disclose how we do the assessments. I will say I've tried to be very poignant about seeking out the feedback. Similarly, just making sure that I understand, am I doing what's expected, not taking it for granted. And so I think there are both obviously formal and informal ways to do it. Try to avail myself of both of those.
I think the evaluations are very important. It's interesting that 3 or 4 boards don't disclose how you evaluate, right? Because you kind of need to do that. But in my board, we don't really have formal evaluations either. But I think that we should. And I think you've been a great thought leader on that, TK, with a lot of the materials you've put together, helping people understand best practices. And now we just need to put them in place. If you don't act like an activist within your boardroom and think like an activist, the activists will come to you.
Okay. Well, I think we're about at the wrap-up question now. And Margaret, maybe I'll ask you first, then go to Grady and Mike. One of the things Leah shared with us is that there are a number of major companies out there who don't have anyone 50 or under. And I know we've had a lot of a discussion that age should not be the only thing. But what would you say, or what kind of advice would you give to directors on boards where, everyone is maybe in their 60s or older, just in terms of the thinking of age diversity?
The thing about it is that we are in a very strong economy. We have been for a decade. We're labor constrained in almost every industry. And the young people coming into the workforce are more educated than they have been. The immigrants who are coming into our country are more educated than they have been in the past. And these public companies are very transparent. So if you see a very seasoned management team, a very vanilla management team or board, you might be less interested in an employment opportunity with that company than a company that has tried harder to demonstrate diversity, whatever that means. So I would think about it in terms of being proactive and creating opportunities for young people, for diverse people, sponsoring them, mentoring them to come up. And maybe they don't add a lot of value at the beginning, but was it the PwC survey that said that the boards that are bringing in next gen are adding a seat?
Yes.
Yeah, which I think is important. So you're warming somebody up, and they still have a vote, but they're learning how to be a director. If every board did that, it would be instrumental.
Because, and I'm glad you brought that up, it's something we weren't necessarily planning on mentioning, but in essence, it's sort of fine to have a theoretical discussion about bringing on more age diversity to a board, but unless you're going to actually expand the board size, that means someone sitting around the table has to put their hand up and be invited not to continue to be on the board. And that gets personal really quickly. So.
Yeah, it gets personal. I think also just arguing for, hey, boards should have a younger board member. Sort of the inverse of that is saying, well, they shouldn't have that 70-year-old board member. I think that'd be a big mistake, as well as coming off as somewhat threatening. I think to me, it's less about, hey, boards, you should absolutely have a younger board member, and maybe more about relaxing some of the requirements that they put around new board members. I've talked to a number of recruiters who have said that companies, have laid out their criteria. We want somebody with deep technical expertise or cybersecurity or M&A in a particular industry, but we do not want a first-time board member. And maybe putting those sort of hurdles in place prevents them from getting somebody who might really bring some good diversity of thought.
Of all of the requirements, if I could just agree with Grady on this, of all the requirements I see people put on board directors, on board director searches, prior public company board experience is the one that I think is easiest to teach. And a lot of the other requirements that folks have are hardest to teach. And so I would, if you find a great talent who can be a fit with the board, who fills out the needs for skills and even age diversity on the board, or ethnic diversity, diversity of sexual orientation or gender, all of which are things that help to create better teams. If you find someone who brings that and the skills that you need and hasn't been on a board before, send them off to a couple of days of governance training and give them a buddy on the board and sort of help them along. That part can be taught.
I think though, Grady is saying that it gets personal. It shouldn't be personal if you have quotas, age, term limits, whatever that it is, that you're focused on. But if you don't have that and you have a very seasoned senior board that is not very independent and is becoming entrenched, you're taking a risk with the company and you're demonstrating to the shareholders and all the stakeholders that you're not making tough decisions. And we're getting paid to make tough decisions because we're representing all the people who are not in the room.
Leah, I think I'm giving you the closing statement. Any other thing to share or any other advice to give?
Well, of course, my biggest piece of advice is if you're interested in this topic, please go read our report because we just kind of brushed the surface of a lot of what we talk about in there. And this is an issue that really is obviously gaining a lot of traction. A lot of people are interested in it. We will continue to be interested in it and we'll be doing more on this topic. So I think we've just kind of started to come into understanding what the service of a younger director looks like and what it will look like in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you so much.